a.m. So the topic of today's presentation is winning proposals. And just to introduce ourselves, Tobin, I'll let you go first.
Okay, so I'm a proposal manager here at ASU in research development within Knowledge Enterprise. I've been a proposal writer and manager since 2015. I started in industry doing project management consulting and information systems consulting. That's where I got my start in proposals. I used to be a journalist and a wine salesman, so I kind of combined writing with sales. It ended up in proposals. My background intellectually is in mass communication research, which is, to be honest, whatever you want it to be. But really, I asked the question why and how people come to believe what it is that they believe. I sort of expanded this with proposals and started looking at how and why people think the way they do and make the decisions they do. So that's where that becomes relevant.
And then my name is Kellyanne Lauer, and I've been with research development since 2017. Before coming to ASU, I worked in nonprofit program management, and I spent most of my time in that arena working in international education. One thing that I think I want to note here is that what Tobin and I are talking about today can really be scaled for any size team. And one thing that Tobin and I get to do is we get to go out and work with teams all across the university. So I just looked at what was the smallest team that I worked with all the way up to the largest, and I've worked with just a single PI team all the way up to a team with over 30 collaborators. So again, all these things that we're talking about can really be scaled smaller and larger. All right, and I'm getting my MBA in May. I start my classes tomorrow, so that was my last 2 classes. So that's what's coming up next for me. Okay, so really quickly, just to plug a few things before we dive in, researchacademy.asu.edu is probably where you found this event. It's where you can find other research development trainings and events. Researchadmin.asu.edu is a great resource as you are putting together a proposal. This is where kind of all of our institutional knowledge that's going to go into your proposals is housed and where you can get a lot of extra help. And then funding.asu.edu is research development's webpage. We are in the process of revamping this, so what I show you today might look a little bit different in 2 months, but the information will mostly be the same. So here, first of all, you can search for funding. We also have our limited submissions linked here, so if the opportunity is limited to just one proposal coming out of ASU, you can click into that platform. If you want to find various resources, again, we link Research Academy here. We do get into the proposal support that we provide. If you need a letter of support, you can click in there as well. And then finally, we do keep a blog where we post different events and kind of current things that are going on in our office. All right, so then we're going to dive into the next section, and we'll just hand off the clicker for you.
All right, that sounds like it's communicating better. Sorry, I had to adjust the mic. So we're talking about what makes a winning proposal, or framed another way, what does a winning proposal look like? So last time, Christina and Jamie talked about strategies for developing a winning proposal. So this focuses less on the development because they covered that very well. And this focuses more on kind of what it might look like afterwards. So to begin with, we're going to, and this gets right at the heart of what they talked about last time, early thorough preparation is essential to a winning proposal. All winning proposals have clearly articulated great ideas. They feature well-built cooperative teams, and we'll talk about how this is obvious in the proposal itself, even if you don't say as much, but just how it reads and everything. They're written to the evaluation criteria. This is in addition to any requirements that might be mandatory. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means again. And then this one's a little bit more abstract, but it's just as important as anyone, and that's positive relationships with your program officers. Kellyanne will embellish more on that, but for now I'll just say that that can mean a lot of different things, and it will mean different things in different agencies, especially depending on the power the program officer has. So that's kind of what we're looking at as a whole. So if anybody has any questions on those, we're gonna go through each of these in detail, but feel free to chime in whenever. Oh, and I should also say there could be other things on this list. So if you have any ideas, feel free to throw them out there. These are just things that we thought were a good starting point for today. So I want to start with a quote from Thomas Edison, and we're going to see a couple other famous people here who talk about the importance of preparation. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on preparation because they did a good job of that last month. But just to underscore what they talked about, so Thomas Edison says, good fortune often happens when opportunity meets with preparation. So this just goes to show you that winning proposals must be planned. I'm going to edit what Thomas Edison said and say that they only happen when opportunities meets with preparation. So you're probably not going to win if you didn't plan well. And this should also happen before the RFP drops, if possible, especially on larger things where you know, so for example, with USAID, they'll often have a request for information or some sort of other thing. With NSF, you'll kind of get like a sense of the yearly funding cycles. With NIH, they have very recurring similar proposals all the time. So the more you can find out about those opportunities in advance. So Oprah said the same thing. This is a truncated version of the full quote, but the essence is still the same. She calls good fortune luck, is preparation meeting opportunity. And then, of course, Sun Tzu is essential to quote whenever we're being competitive with people or battling. He's a ancient Chinese general and philosopher, for those who don't know. He says, one who fully prepared awaits the unprepared will be victorious. So what we mean here is half-hearted preparation isn't going to cut it. So again, you have to be fully prepared. You can't just do part of it because otherwise it's going to show in your final draft. So this part, Kellyanne is going to talk about. How would you know what a well-planned proposal looks like?
All right, so first of all, it's going to be very clear from reading a well-planned proposal that the PI and the team have actually done their homework, that they've done their due diligence in researching the sponsor. All right, that they've done their due diligence in researching their sponsor and what the mission is, and that this is actually reflected in the language that you use in the proposal. So as you read through an RFA, you're going to pull out different terms and different words, and you're actually going to use those in your proposal and use the same language. All right, it's also going to be obvious that this is written for reviewers. It's not written for yourself. It's not written for your team. It's not written for other scientists in your field. Rather, it's written at a panel of reviewers who may be scientists in your field, but they may also just be other government officials. It's also aimed at decision makers, so as they read through, they can check off their rubric, and it makes it easy for them to make a decision. They don't have to dig for information.
Kellyanne,
Yeah.
you need to underline that, bold it, and put an exclamation.
Aimed at decision makers. Yes. Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one. You're not just writing a journal article. You're not just writing an email to your team. It's really serving a different purpose. Next up, your team's going to appear logical and intentional. It's not just going to look like you walk down the hall, you talk to the people that you collaborate with every day, or you talk to people that you've known for 10 years and put them on your team. It's really going to look like you read the RFA, you figured out what the teaming requirements were, and you also really thought through what advantages you were bringing to this project, what gaps you had, and you filled in those gaps with a very intentional team. Next up, this kind of aligns with the last one. You are asking for money, could be a couple $100,000, could be a few million, and they're going to give you that money over a period of performance. So they're going to give you that money for 2 years, for 4 years, for 5 years, 6 years. You need to show them that you've thought through what those years actually look like. So you're not just getting your ideas down on paper, getting them out the door for the proposal, and then figuring it out later. You actually have thought through a schedule. How is this going to logically work? What key milestones do we have? What sort of risk mitigation strategies do we have to stay on schedule as well? And then this is just a great kind of thought here. Just like any great journal article or any great book or anything that we read, you can really tell when a lot of thought and preparation has gone into this. It's going to show up in the final product.
All right, so something that I'm going to talk a little bit about that I know that Michael in the front row and I think about all the time is that great ideas have to be sold. So your proposals aren't going to win by ideas alone. There is a belief, especially within certain sponsoring agencies, that that's true. And to some extent it is, but because every proposal is so competitive, no matter how small, you really have to go out of your way to try to sell it. And there's been other presentations we've done that focus on more of those techniques. We're only going to hit on some of them here and show you some examples of proposals at ASU that were either extremely well reviewed or actually won. Like everything in life, people buy something because people buy from somebody because someone is convinced that there is something in it for them. So what we're talking about here is value and benefits. So this is from a proposal to the Rhode Island Commerce Authority, I believe. It might have a slightly different title, but that's the essence of what it was. And this was announced just recently that ASU actually won this. We're going to be working with the University of Rhode Island and part of this project in Rhode Island called the Innovation, what's the actual name of it? Sorry, guys. The Rhode Island Innovation Campus. So what we're looking at is the executive summary. So this would be the first thing that somebody would see. So first up here it says, having made its mark in such traditional industries as healthcare, financial services, and ocean technology, Rhode Island is now seeking to strengthen its foothold in the new economy with the aim of fostering business growth, job creation, and a new investment. So what we're saying here is that we get you, we did our research, and we read your RFP. Now, there's no right or wrong way to start a proposal per se. We usually advocate with leading with a slightly different sentence. This author, who is not me, by the way, had decided to go a slightly different direction, and that's fine. What you're doing here is recognizing that you, indeed, not only did we read the RFP, but we also bothered to do some Googling and find out that, oh look, here's the core of Rhode Island's traditional industries, healthcare, financial services, and ocean technology. So we're expanding on that. So if you were writing a DoD proposal or an NSF proposal, it might be slightly different. With the NSF, you're probably not going to have as much information on that specific call because they're more ambiguous or academic, but we'll get to an example of that here in a minute. So this is what we'll do for you. I don't want to read this word for word because I know you guys can do that, but we have the team led by ASU, and we're going to accelerate and optimize. There may have been a typo here, so we'll have to excuse that. But we created a hub focused on educating students and fostering entrepreneurship to encourage new products, jobs, and companies. Okay, so these are very concrete things we're doing them. We're giving them enough detail to give them specifics, but we're not overwhelming them with another 3 paragraphs at this point, because it is an executive summary, but also because it's not really necessary in that first few sentences. So last but not least, this is our evidence, and we're going to get more on how this ties into a benefit, but we've got 30 years of experience in establishing and sustaining innovation zones. And by the way, we're also tossing in some matching funds. We're going to partner with the University of Rhode Island, so we've already identified and made this partnership. We've picked out our square footage, so that shows, again, that planning comes into play, but this also mentioning it here, this very specific number, that tells you we aren't just saying that we're going to make this and someone thought of this last night. We've actually gone out and looked at actual spaces. So little details like that can make all the difference in the world in the reviewer's head, because if I see this, you know, I could have made up a number, but I think it would have been pretty obvious once you read the rest of the proposal that anything more than that would have been overkill, and too much less than that, there wouldn't have been enough space. So we're going to look at, there's some other parts of this proposal and other proposals looking at benefits statements. So this is a repeat of what we did in proposal writing 1 last fall, if I'm not mistaken. And you can find that presentation. Is that on funding, or is it on funding.asu.edu in past events? And I highly recommend, if you haven't read that one, go back and look at that, because that goes over this in detail. So we're going to breeze through that right now, because I know this audience has already seen that presentation probably 3 times. But so you start with your features. Those are pretty obvious things that you have to offer. Then you have to have evidence, which suggests that you've probably implemented those features before in some way, or maybe if you're proposing a research or an academic research proposal, it could be as simple as that we've done some preliminary studies, we have preliminary data, things like that. It could be past publications. Quantified value. This is what I was getting at with that 7,500 square feet of space. Now, that space in and of itself is not a value to Rhode Island. That's an example of something that's quantified, but it's really just a feature. So we have to specify what's an actual quantified value look like. Those combine and become a benefit to the customer. So we're going to look at this. This was the project description. I did write this, but there's a little bit of editing from some other people too. So this is still very much a group effort. So the first thing I want to point out is this. This is kind of our thesis. So the creation of an all-in-one cybersecurity innovation hub that connects workforce training, research capacity, entrepreneurship, and the people of Rhode Island. So this is what we're doing. But again, we've been very specific, and we're also talking beyond because we understand our customer is not just this commerce authority. I think something that's common that I've seen a lot of academic proposals, but really all proposals in general involving government entities, is they neglect to think about the fact that really you're talking about ultimately the people paying for this are the taxpayers. So you have to go back and think about what's in it for them and really underscore that, even to the agencies, because they're aware of this too. And they know that ultimately they have to either answer to Congress, or in the case of the Rhode Island Commerce Authority, it might be the governor's office, it could be the Rhode Island General Assembly, any number of those things. So everybody needs a benefit, not just the people in office, not just your sponsoring agency. So we'll set up the state as a leader in cybersecurity education and innovation for decades to come. So this is our value statement. Earlier, this is just the actual thing that we're doing, and a feature of it is the connecting workforce, training, blah, blah, blah. Some people would say, well, how is that not a value? Well, because connecting these things doesn't really do anything unless it results in something, right? If I connect entrepreneurs to researchers, what difference does it make to the average person or to your end product? It doesn't matter. They could have all the meetings in the world, and most people aren't going to get a benefit from that. So here's where we go and say, okay, we're speaking to the state officials. State is a leader. We're also speaking to business people in the state. Cybersecurity education and innovation for decades to come. So here, we're not specifying an exact value. We're giving a more generic one. I can't actually say how long this innovation center will be in play. It may be 10 years. It has to be at least, I think, 5. But it could be 10 years. It could be 30. Who knows? But we do know from other studies, which we'll get to here in a second, that this could potentially generate millions of dollars in revenue. So that speaks directly to the state. Creating thousands of jobs comes back more to the people, but also to the General Assembly. So again, there's kind of something in it for everybody with these value statements. So that's the whole thing. I'm not going to, again, read any of this, but you'll see that this is, our hub will have 5 parts. So these are some themes we repeated throughout the proposal. We actually have headings for each of these in subsequent sections. So that's another way you can structure your proposals in a way that makes it easy and relates back, is saying, okay, here we have these things, and then you repeat them again. So we're going with why should they care. So this gets at the part of when Christine and Jamie were talking about Heilmeyer's Catechism last time. They started by, Heilmeyer starts basically by asking, what are you proposing, or what are you trying to do? And he wants you to articulate that using no jargon. So we tried to do that here, and just to let you guys know, as I'm sure you do, jargon can come in many forms. It's not just fancy buzzwords. It's not just science. It happens in everything. In fact, business is probably among the worst. So I tried my hardest to get rid of things that are just too fluffy or ambiguous or don't mean as much for everybody. And that's part of what helps sell these things, is when people see those concretes and they see less nebulous concepts beyond that. Okay, so but this goes to why should they care. This is one of Heilmeyer's questions too. So here we have an actual heading that says exactly why they should care. So we're going to partner with Rhode Island and its people for success. Well, again, this is just kind of an abstraction. So here we go, and we give them something more concrete. We have world-class cybersecurity and entrepreneurship expertise and decades plus experience creating operation innovation hubs and campuses. So here we're giving our past experience. That will give Rhode Island and its people the spark it needs to ignite decades of economic growth. So that's what they really want. Then we talk about our contribution. And then last but not least, we kind of relate it back to them. And this is where doing your homework is handy. And this, I actually have to thank the people I was working with on this, because I had originally a quote from another senator who wasn't the one in Rhode Island, and I knew that, but I didn't know that Jack Reed had ever said anything about cybersecurity. So she said, hey, can we find something from Jack Reed? So I went and I Googled Jack Reed quotes on cybersecurity. Lo and behold, there's probably stuff for every politician. Even if it's just something small on their webpage, that's enough to work with, that it says, oh, look, we are appealing to who you are, and we understand that this is what you want. So that's where a group effort is significant, and where having somebody review what I originally wrote really helped out. This is a much more obvious example of quantified value, which is why I want to put it in here. What they were ultimately interested in with this proposal was economic impact on their state. That's why this kind of might seem a little bit boring, and it's a bunch of numbers and taxes, and we're just like, oh, I don't care. Well, that's exactly what they did care about. So bear with me, because this is what we're looking at with all of these things. So you can see contributing $115 million and 1,000 jobs. So here we've quantified this. Now, I want to talk a little bit about numbers. There's a much better lecture on this. Come talk to me privately if you want me to talk about it from an APMP member who used to be a lawyer. You don't have to have exact evidence for a lot of these. Now, in science, you probably do. You don't want to just make things up. But it's okay if you can't. I can't actually prove to Rhode Island this is going to contribute $115 million and 1,000 jobs. But we qualified that because we expect. I didn't say we will. I didn't say for sure. And then we also said the project could generate. So these figures are actually based on what SkySong was able to do here in Arizona. So I was able to use those, scale them down as needed be, and then offer something similar in Rhode Island. That was kind of the idea. So still, we've got a time frame within 10 years, because this is what did happen for SkySong. So now we sound like we're going to just generate them money and they'll look at all this amazing stuff. So it's a way of saying we could do this for you without overpromising. So again, that's quantified benefits without overpromising. And you could do this easily in a science. This is a much more obvious context. But in science, sometimes I know that you can say, well, we have this treatment or something that could lead to a treatment. Sometimes it's just basic research that 10 years down the road will eventually result in a new vaccine or a new drug or something. You can still talk about those sorts of things. And I encourage those of you who are staff and work with faculty to do that and to push them in those directions, and those of you who are faculty to move in those directions. So we then have, again, why should we care? So another crux of this proposal was cybersecurity, and there were a couple people who helped out in my office, including one of our competitive intelligence folks, who did a bunch of research. She had already known a lot about cybersecurity in a political and social context, but she was able to bring a lot of this information here. So what we're doing here is, why should you care about cybersecurity? So if I was writing a more academic proposal, or I mean, not proposal, a more academic paper, I might just start with current salaries in cybersecurity, right? But there would be no benefit. So here we're telling them exactly, focusing on cybersecurity will bring thousands of jobs, $1 million. So we're repeating ourselves that we repeated in the previous section, but there we were talking about the whole project and economic development. Now we're specifically talking about cybersecurity. So it's still all about projected job openings and some other things, and worldwide spending information. So you see how we're building this case. Everything here is, okay, by the way, financial services companies are increasing IT security spending. There's all this evidence here to suggest, by the way, if you're not doing this, you're not going to be winning, because you have to focus on this as part of the growing world. So Rhode Island jumped at that and said, hey, why not? Yes. I'm sorry? They're contained within the text. So there's a Gartner forecast, and according to Thales. So the reason is because this was a non-academic proposal. So if I had written an academic proposal, I would have gone and said, I probably would still put according to Thales, but I'd have a little reference there. And I would put it, of course, in an academic proposal where you're page limited. This one, I don't remember if we were page limited. If we were, it was a little consequence because it didn't really matter, because they had plenty of space. But I would put, my reference here, and I'd refer them back. And thanks for bringing that up, because that is a good point. When you're talking about these in academic context, And that would help even in a non-academic context. Sometimes you probably should include references. But I'd say generally speaking, a commercial proposal, as long as you say that it was Thales, they can probably Google this and come up on the first 2 Google headings and it'll be right there. Now, that's being very presumptive of my reader, but I also, to be strategic on this, probably don't want them reading the entire document. So instead of giving them a reference, I'm just gonna have to trust that they know what I'm talking about. It's sort of a dual technique there. Okay, last but not least example from this, I wanted to show you how graphic elements raise attention to key selling points. You may or may not have the space for this in your NSF and NIH proposals. In fact, I probably wouldn't encourage this in most academic proposals because this takes up, maybe 15% of a page. But in a commercial proposal where people are probably only reading certain sections, it's really important to bring loud and proud attention to the things that you're really offering as benefits. So again, we're talking about job demand and forecasted growth in cybersecurity. And by the way, this all follows that previous paragraph. We also have a quote down here from Lloyd's of London reports a similar global cyber attack could cost businesses and consumers that amount. So this speaks right to another persuasive technique, which is fear of loss. Believe it or not, this is one of the most powerful motivators and with humans. You'll actually find that if you ask people if they would take a second job to buy a new big screen television, most of them will say no. But if you ask them if they'll take a second job to save their home that they're already living in, most of them will say yes. So that's what we're talking about. So it's a similar thing. I may not spend a bunch of money on cybersecurity to earn an additional $121 billion, but I almost certainly would spend it to save myself from losing that $121.4 billion. Okay, and then this is a more academic example. Bear with me, guys. I know that this gets tedious. So again, we did our research, we read your RFP, we referenced the US government here because that's ultimately our customer. This specifically was a MIRI proposal to the DoD. This one did not win, but it was very well reviewed, and I'll get to why we don't think it won in just a minute here. Well, we kind of know because we got the scoring later, but but it wasn't for this paragraph. So again, research done through Hermes will support blah, 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 blah. That you guys can read that. That's all what we'll do for you exactly, but not too much detail. This was kind of a social science proposal, by the way, with some other biology and some other things. It was very truly multidisciplinary. So here's our actual benefit and what they really, really want for this. So that's part of the reason I wanted to show you. This particular call required it. We understood that the DoD isn't going to spend all this money just on a science experiment, right? They don't really actually care about human environmental migration or the human relationship to the environment unless there's some national security benefit. And it's kind of hard to talk about an immediate national security benefit with some of these things, except anticipating how human populations react to large-scale changes. That would be, but we said, okay, we know that eventually what you really are looking for is a tool that allows the government to anticipate human responses before a situation. Now, they didn't ask for a tool, because remember, these MIRIs are basic research, but we knew that at some point they were going to probably want one. So those are the types of things where you may only get that information talking to your program officer. You may have to just sort of make a conjecture about it. In this case, the PI I was working with used to be a program officer and worked on the MIRI, so she had a very thorough understanding of how the DoD viewed these things. But at the same time, we knew, okay, we aren't building you a tool. We're saying eventually this research could help you build a tool. All right, so the last thing is my little curse of knowledge mummy here, and then I'll hand it off to Kellyanne for a little while. This is just something that the term comes from Steven Pinker, and I can't emphasize this enough because I see it every day, even sometimes when we're talking about proposals, where you just kind of assume that people know what you know, and you have a hard time imagining what it's like not to know. You even see this at Taco Bell. Sometimes you might say, that, or another restaurant, where someone's kind of rude to you because you don't understand the menu, and they don't understand what it's like to not understand the menu because they stare at it every day, all day. And so you just think they're a jerk, they think you're stupid, and now can you imagine when we scale that up to the complexity of sciences or any sort of thing? So the way to eliminate this is imagine what other people don't know and try to eliminate that jargon, eliminate acronyms as much as possible or spell them out. Don't just assume people know them. And try to write for a broader audience. Obviously, you're still going to be writing for that focused audience on a lot of proposals, particularly like NIH. You're not going to dumb it down to a 6th grade level, but you are going to make sure that it's good enough that people that, say, study lung tissue wouldn't not understand it just because it's about cancer or something like that. So, okay, this is on, I'll tell you now.
Thank you. All right, so the next up we're going to talk about how you bring together that very intentional, very logical team. We'll go through how you actually go about building that team, and then also give you a couple of examples about how this would show up in your proposal that hopefully wins. So first of all, you've got you, the single PI, single person, the shell. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to strategically add people and partners. So Tobin referenced this at the beginning. A lot of times you know what calls are coming out pretty far down the road. So you should start building teams for those calls now. If you start building a team the day that a solicitation comes out or shortly thereafter, you are behind. Does not mean you cannot still put together a great proposal, but we really recommend that you start doing this well in advance. One of the ways to do this is to, again, look at what you can do, look at the gaps, look at what you think you need to actually win, and start building your team out from there. There are some teams that do this really well across the universities. One of the tools that I think is particularly useful is to actually build out a teaming matrix. So you take whatever information you have. It might be a previous call, might be a draft solicitation, information from conversations with the program officer, and you actually list out everything that you need line by line. And then you create a column for yourself, and you go through and you check off everything that you can do and that you are the best person to do, which is not necessarily everything that you can do. And then you look at your remaining gaps, and that slowly helps you think out who else you need to add to your team. And if you don't write this out, and if you don't have a place to go back and reference, you could very easily forget to add something. And then when you are talking to people, treat it like an interview. Don't just go and talk to one person and they say, yes, I can join your team. And you say, great, done, on to the next person. Really talk to them, because what you might think they can do, maybe they can't actually do that very well. Or maybe their research has actually gone off in a different direction. And even though their past publications say that they have expertise in this, they're not really working in that specific subfield anymore. You might also find that when you're talking to somebody that they can do more than what you originally thought. So make sure you're having those conversations. Or you might find that they have a very particular collaboration that fills other gaps on your team as well. And that would be better to leverage that existing collaboration than to go out and find somebody else who's completely disconnected. So I really recommend using some sort of a matrix. It can be in Word, it can be in Excel. It doesn't have to be anything super formal, but just something to keep you organized. The next step is to actually bring them together. Tobin and I are really recommending to our teams that they schedule a 2 to 3 hour or half day or full day or multi-day strategy session with their team, really whatever the team can handle. And we've seen that the more time you put in up front and the more time you can devote to actually getting people in a room, there's thousands of conference rooms at ASU, find one, get some flip chart, get a whiteboard, and sit there and hash out a lot of the details and really get into the dirt of your proposal. That's going to start building that collaboration, and you're going to work a lot of things out in those meetings. Trying to do this over email doesn't work that well. Trying to do this over a really hasty Zoom conference call where somebody's in the airport, somebody's driving between campuses, 90% of the people are not prepped for the meeting. That doesn't necessarily work very well either, especially if you only have a half an hour, even an hour to actually talk through all of these things. And then next, meet early and often to discuss ideas and proposal logistics. So here, we always recommend that you do a kickoff. When the solicitation drops, you get your whole team together and you actually do a kickoff where you review the opportunity, you answer any questions, you kind of set up norms around communication and deadlines, and you get all those questions answered for folks. This doesn't mean that you cannot meet before the solicitation drops. If you're planning on applying to something that you know is a couple years down the road, schedule maybe quarterly meetings or something. So you're continuing to talk and actually discuss ideas. And then once the solicitation does actually drop, you can have that kickoff, and you can even continue with We usually recommend weekly check-ins. Some teams even do daily check-ins, which is probably overkill for most teams. But just a 15 to 20-minute call once a week, just to check in, get progress updates from everybody. And that really helps keep from at the end of the proposal, you only have 1 or 2 problems that you need to quickly troubleshoot. You don't have 10, because that can very quickly happen. That can very quickly happen if you're not actually keeping track of things. All right, next up, involve your research administrator and proposal manager and any other research development staff that are supporting you. Everybody who applies to a grant opportunity will have a research administrator. They're going to be your main point of contact at the unit level for any questions on compliance, for your budget, a lot of other items that they can help you with. Proposal managers will really come into play for kind of the larger, more strategic proposals. So if we're working with you as well, make sure to include us. These proposal managers and research administrators, we support a lot of the aspects of the proposal that are not direct science, but are equally as important in determining whether or not your proposal gets reviewed and gets scored well. All right, and then finally, seek out external reviewers and experts and consultants, whether they're internal to ASU or even external to ASU. You don't have all of the knowledge in your field, but you do have access to it if you reach out and ask. So if you are proposing something, maybe some of the science is a little bit new to you, maybe there's a member on your team and you don't completely understand exactly how they're going to fit in, ask them who can help us determine how this kind of meshes together. Are we communicating in the right way to all the different scientific fields that we're going to be applying to, or that might be included in the review panel? So really think through and really reach out to those people, because they can add a lot of knowledge that you don't necessarily have when you're sitting down to write at 9 p.m. at night or any other time. All right, and then how will this look in a proposal? So this is just one example. A lot of text, don't read it. That's not the point of this. What I do want to show you is that this is something that you could build for planning purposes. You could even put it into a proposal. This particular one went into USAID. So they expect to see these things. They expect to see tables that are really laying out the roles and responsibilities and the skills and expertise of all of your different team members. Not every sponsor is going to expect to see this. You might not have room in some of your other proposals, but if you build this out, it'll be useful for you. And then you could even write even just 2 to 3 sentences or a paragraph narrative talking about how your team really brings together the skills and expertise that are needed and what everybody's specific roles and responsibilities are. You can plug this into your proposal very easily. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else up here. With some of the NSF ones that I've worked on this year, they've actually requested, usually as section 1 or 2, to list every single member of your team, to list their relevant expertise and skills, and then what their specific project role is. And this has been an interesting exercise to work through with these teams, because a lot of times people will just send me an entire paragraph that they kind of have typed up already, but it's not directly applicable to the project. So that's something to think through too. I don't need to know every single subfield expertise that you have. I need to know what is specifically being applied to this project. And those have gone into tabular form that looks like a much more condensed version of this. All right, next up, I'll hand it back over to Tobin here.
All right, so earlier we were talking about writing to the evaluation criteria. And again, we're going to visit the MURI, which, by the way, speaking of the curse of knowledge, that's the multidisciplinary university research initiative that's issued by the Department of Defense annually and has been for several years now. I've now worked on that particular call 3 years running with, I guess, 4 different teams. And one thing that I noticed that was interesting in particular is evaluation criteria have been evolving on that one. Like, they're not even the same year after year. So it's really interesting. So first, we're going to look at, this is the criteria. This would have been a solicitation for funding in 2018. So they'd call it MURI 2018, but it was really due in 2017. And if you look at here, the question is, okay, where do I get the evaluation criteria? And the answer is usually they're in the proposal, or I'm sorry, either the request for proposal or the funding opportunity announcement or the dozens of other names by we call the solicitation. Some agencies will not have them in that proposal, but they'll have them elsewhere. they'll have a formal document where it says this is how we score these, or sometimes it might be the division level or at the institute or the center if you're NIH. But either way, someplace, somewhere for your sponsor, you can find how they evaluate. And if you don't do that, you're going to be really fighting an uphill battle because you might spend way too much time talking about something that's not even scored. Or you may not spend enough time talking about something that's very heavily scored, which we'll get to here in a second, which ended up costing us the proposal. So this should go without saying that you pay a lot of attention to this with any sponsor, but the fact that the sponsor is telling you that number 2 is potential DoD relevance and contribution to the DoD mission, after spending literally like 7 or 8 times as many lines talking about science and technical merits, should tell you that that's really important. Oh, and by the way, in case you forgot, they're telling you it's important. So you see down here that that plays back into it. Now, what's interesting is you could almost say that this statement here also applies to 1, 2, and 3 here. We didn't really think that, and we thought the fact that this was such an afterthought, the integration of students, really didn't matter very much. Well, that was a big mistake on our part because the way that this ended up being reviewed by the panel, some people on the panel were fine with how much we wrote about students and research, and other people thought that we didn't write enough. And so we lost too many points on that when the rest of the whole thing scored really well. So that goes to show you that even when you write to the evaluation criteria, and this is a paragraph we included, training involving students, that is right where it speaks to this, but they didn't like the fact that this was too generic. Well, okay, but how are we supposed to say a whole lot else beyond it? We'll get to why that may have changed in a second. So if you can see, here's heading 10, here's heading 9, that's exactly how it appeared. So we're using this as a lesson learned for the rest of the university, not to ignore things like that. So moving on, this is the evaluation criteria from what would have been last fall, that is now will be funded this year if you got funded. And so as you can see, they're completely different. Let's look at the first one. That looked like that. It's a long laundry list that was hard to follow. They had students in there, availability of funds, potential DoD relevance. They changed it, okay? So what's interesting to me is students aren't even on here. Now, you're still supposed to write about them because there is an actual section that's prescribed where you're supposed to talk about training involving students. But here, I don't know if I would change it that much. You definitely want to give a little bit more specifics than we probably did there. That was our lesson. But again, look at how the evaluation criteria have changed. So now what's interesting is that there's still a potential relevance, but they've added availability of the PI. That's new. That's probably because they had too many people applying who are already at 85%. Another one that was new, impact of interactions with other organizations.
Your mic is turned off.
Oh, is it?
Or you cut out.
Is that better? My mic's on. Hello? No, it's not working.
You might have to share mics, I think.
Why don't you grab a hand?
Testing. Oh, wow. It's like night and day. Okay. So this is interesting because we did actually spend some time on this, and I asked the program officer about this one because we didn't understand what this meant. So you've got DoD laboratories, industry and other organizations that perform research and development for defense applications. How are we supposed to know what's going on? So this is where you don't just say, hey, I don't know, I give up, let me move on. We actually asked the program officer, do you know of any of these activities? Because you might be funding them, someone else might be funding them, et cetera, et cetera. That was the heading we included. Now, I can't share what goes underneath it because this proposal is still being considered. But what I can tell you is that we had a heading that described exactly these, And what was a huge help to us was that one of our collaborators / co-PIs on this proposal was actually being funded by this program officer for very similar research. It doesn't always work out that well. That probably is going to happen more in DoD than other places. But that's the point. So if you saw us, and by the way, all federal agencies generally like it when you build on their pre-existing research. So if you don't know of any, it's probably helpful to go find out. So as a corollary to that, it's not just right for the evaluation criteria, but right for the evaluators. My brief story here is this is now common knowledge, and the project has begun. The ASU won an advanced grant, which is an NSF program for advancing women in the university. And our particular proposal was to get women from that mid-level associate professors and up to full professors and beyond. So we had done a lot of homework on this, especially the evaluators, especially the PI and then one of the co-PIs, and looking at who is really in this field, because this was a very specific topic that is really only reviewed by not too many people in the country, and that's probably going to be the case more often than not in a lot of fields. So you have to make sure that you cite their research. We had several of these potential evaluators on our external review board before we turned in our proposal to the actual NSF, and several of them pointed out, you didn't cite my research. Now, we didn't know necessarily that they had an article. Another one of them said, you have somebody at ASU who's working on this, you should probably cite them. So you find out all kinds of things from using those external reviews, but that's particularly how you can write for the evaluators. Now, none of the people on our external review could be on the evaluation panel because they were in a conflict of interest. But that's one example of how an evaluator would look at that. So you can do that in any field. You don't want to turn in something, even if it's on some subfield of biology, without citing the people who might be reviewing. And then how do we know who's going to evaluate your proposal? Well, again, this is where you have to read your solicitations, look at your sponsor stuff. Every single agency is a little bit different, but I wanted to show you, for example, in the MIRIs, they tell you exactly how it's going to undergo a multi-stage evaluation procedure. Research topic chief is going to look at it. And also, I didn't highlight this as much, but other government scientific experts, those are there, but they're hard to come by because they generally don't always keep those people full-time employed. Government business professionals are going to read it, and they may not all read the same sections, but you still have to make sure that they can at least understand the abstract, right? That's the point here. They may not understand middle of the thing in full, and that's okay. Support contractors or advisors external to U.S. government. These may be other scientists. See where it says subject matter expert, technical consultants. They may be any number of things, but that's when the program officer doesn't have expertise in a specific field, he or she might go out and find it. Last but not least, if you read down here, findings of all these people will be forwarded to senior DoD officials who will actually make recommendations to the awarding officials. So we have all this, and still they don't get to decide. They can just go and say, we think it should be this, but here's the people who actually make the decision. And I guarantee you these people aren't scientists. So that's where you have to make sure that you're writing for everybody for this call. Other ones you want to look at that too. Did you have a question online? Okay. This is Kellyanne now.
Mm-hmm. I don't need the mic, just the clicker. Thank you. Okay, so this is the last thing we're going to talk about today, and this is something that we know and hope you've heard 100 times, but there is a reason why we are saying it again and why everybody says it. Maintaining a positive relationship with your program officers is one of the most crucial ways to ensure your success in terms of funding. It's going to give you a lot of insights through your conversations with them. It's going to give you a lot of ways to get feedback on your ideas before you go through all of the effort in terms of getting a proposal together and submitting it. So there's 3 simple ways to do this. You can email. We were just in an NIH training, I think last week, where the trainer actually provided an email template. I'll summarize it for you guys. It's just keep it really short, simple, provide a draft of an abstract of your project, and then ask the program officer a direct and specific question. Do not just send it to them and say, hey, what do you think? That's a much larger conversation, but if you can start the conversation with a specific question that you have, they can help answer that question. That kind of opens the door to more questions as well. Call them. If you're able to get them on the phone, we all know that a conversation, you're going to get a lot more information. You're going to get a lot more little bulbs that are popping off in your head as they're talking about what they want to see in these proposals. So if you can call them, we do recommend that. It's much better than just a sterile email question response conversation. Finally, meet them. If you can, I know that ASU does have funding resources for faculty members to go to DC and meet with their program officers. We do highly recommend that. Or if there's a regional conference or something happening in the area or somewhere else in the United States that you're traveling to, actually go there, see if you can set up a meeting with a program officer to meet at that meeting as well. And then finally, just make sure you're following the rules. Different sponsors do have norms and actual rules about who you can contact and when you can contact them. One example here, USAID has a very formal question and answer period where you are only allowed to submit questions during a specified amount of time, and then they publish all of the answers, and that's the only engagement that you can have. So that's a lot different than the NIH, where it's expected that you actually go and you talk to multiple program officers, and again, as we learned in the training last week, you're expected to actually shop your idea around. Say, hey, here's my idea, I'm talking to these 10 people, I just want to find a good fit for it. And so that's a lot more kind of a conversation that's happening back and forth to make sure that you're getting to the right spot. And then Tobin, I think you have an example from the advance that highlights kind of one key way of talking to the program officers and how that can help you.
Yeah, so what we did, we actually had a call that we scheduled with, and there were 2 of them for that, and we just asked them a bunch of questions. I didn't really do any much of the asking. It was mostly led by the PI and the co-PI. And that was very helpful because it gave us a lot of guidance. I think that was, if I recall correctly, actually a resubmission. So those, especially if you're resubmitting, you can ask specifics to your proposal or specifics to your situation.
Mm-hmm. And it's important too that the faculty member and the PI has those conversations. If you want to draft an email and run it by your research administrator or proposal manager or somebody else who can help you think through the draft, if you're just nervous about if what you're saying is right, go ahead and do that. But they're not going to, the program officers don't really care about the relationship with us proposal managers or the research administrators. They're really looking to develop a relationship with the scientist. So it's really important that you drive those conversations and that we aren't sending these emails for you and then kind of trying to interpret these highly technical conversations that we don't have any expertise in. So just make sure, yep, go ahead. Well, actually, wait 1 second for our microphone, thanks.
So I was looking at a proposal for a program that has program officers that discourage, they do not meet with people because they consider it to be biased. They don't want people to have an advantage by having met with them. And they'll answer questions over email, and I don't know if they'll do a call. I almost feel like a little nervous to contact them because I don't want to bother them or something. They're like, look, this is, you know, we have a limited amount of time to do this. And there's almost no information on the call on the website. So naturally, we have a lot of questions. So I don't know if there's a recommendation for those kind of, you know, grumpy program officers. I don't know.
Yeah, so if the call says that they can't talk to you, or if the agency has that rule, again, the USAID example was a pretty good example of they can't talk to you during the procurement process because it is crossing too many lines. A lot of times, those calls that don't allow conversations with the program officers might have a webinar where they will go through and present information publicly, and they might take some questions and answers publicly. If you've missed the webinar, usually there's a transcript or a recording with the questions and answers available, so you can at least see what other people are asking, and it's likely there's going to be some overlap with your questions. Otherwise, they might also do something like what USAID does, where they have a period where you can ask questions, and the way that works is you email them all of your questions. It might be asking to clarify contradicting info in the solicitation, or what did you mean when you said this? You submit all those questions, and then they publish a Q&A, which is going to show up wherever the solicitation is published. There isn't one. Yeah, I don't I don't know if I have any recommendations. Do you guys, anyone else in the room? We've got a lot of proposal experts. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be
Information.
my recommendation, is pay attention to the history of the solicitation, because, I mean, that was the case with the advanced. That's what most of our information with the, even with the call to programmers, they can only say so much. But a lot of it was like, what specifically was wrong with last year's, and they may or may not be able to answer those questions. You should ask them whatever comes to your mind, as long as it's a very focused question, not just, will you like my idea? They won't answer that.
No.
But they will answer very specific ones, and if you can ask those over email, that's fine. Is this by chance a contract, or is it a cooperative agreement? Do you know? Okay,
grant, yeah.
because that's interesting, because sometimes, like what Kellyanne's alluding to with contracts, they're, because of the rules, they're forbidden. But yeah, I would just look at the history then. And,
Yeah.
Yeah, and you might even be able to ask people who've already been awarded what they did. They may not tell you, because they may have reapplied, but they might. It depends.
Yeah, yeah. And then everyone else is in the same boat as you. So, yeah. Yep. But it can be frustrating, especially if you do have questions where you're trying to figure out what they want the most. All right, so then that brings us to the end of our presentation. So just to kind of recap here, so why do proposals win? Again, you've prepared, you've started early. You've really clearly articulated your ideas through your writing and through graphics. You have a really well-built team that works well together. You've written to the evaluation criteria and to the reviewers themselves. And again, you have those positive relationships with program officers where and when you can. All right, so I'll just run through a couple things, and then we'll open it up for last 5 minutes of Q&A here. So we do have some upcoming events that are sponsored by Research Development. There's a couple of kickoffs, campus-wide kickoffs coming up if you're interested in learning more about these opportunities. We have 2 more proposal development workshops coming up this spring. The first topic is debriefs and next steps. The next topic is pivoting your message. You can register for all of these in Research Academy. And find all the information about them there. And then we'll just open it up for questions.
Kellyanne, I'll just add that for the pivoting your message, what we mean by that is if you applied to NIH and they didn't like it, could you apply to NSF? The MURI is what we were talking about through a lot of the solicitation, or I'm sorry, a lot of this presentation. That was where you saw the excerpts of the solicitation. So if you want to apply to this year's MURI, or you think you might be interested, or you work with faculty who might be interested, come March 26th. Any questions?
Right. Thanks. On the Pivoting Your Message workshop, do you have any examples or ideas around synthesis research, and then how to move from synthesis research to more targeted, like NSF or, primary research generation proposals? Is that going to be something
We
that's dealt with at all?
can propose that
Okay.
to whoever's leading the workshop. It's somebody from our office. I just can't remember who's leading that one. Okay. So actually, it's not.
Okay. Yeah,
So
and-
we'll take note of that though. Yeah, and if it's something that
pressure.
they can talk about.
So this was for PIs, and that's great, but as people who manage proposals or help PIs do proposals, what role do you play? Like, you can tell them, okay, cite reviewers, but you don't necessarily, the people who might be your reviewers, you don't necessarily, you don't know the research. Talk to your program officer. You can give them all this advice, but how do you make them do it?
That's an age-old question, I suppose, for those of us staff who work with faculty. But I think you really have to get at the core of what it is that they're doing and why they want to do it. We've started asking more motivational style questions about this, and sometimes they sound dumb or obvious. And yeah, you can even embarrass yourself because they sound so obvious. I've done it in a meeting. But I think it's much more useful and tends to get the team much more involved if they understand. and say out loud themselves, yes, I want to win, yes, I'm in this. And we can talk about that offline. One thing I wanted to say as an addendum to that is, I know we kind of went quickly through all those sections with all these types of ideas, and there was a lot to do with this. Kellyanne and I both are happy to answer any questions. You can come talk to us or ask any of us for our emails or whatever. It's very difficult to cover this broad of a turf. So I can always, and there's always exceptions, right? Like I've seen poorly written proposals funded, much to my surprise, but I've also seen very well written proposals outdo other ones that may have even been better ideas, quote unquote, or maybe more scientifically sound, whatever. So
I would say too, if you can, I mean, we don't want to take on too much or kind of get out of our lane, but with the program officers, if you can send them, hey, here's a quick outline of what your email should look like. Even just some sort of, because maybe there's just a mental block there. I just don't want to write the email because I know I'm just going to agonize over it for an hour, even though it should be a relatively quick email. So if you can just say, hey, I wrote your opening sentence, insert your question here, and just those small things. But it is hard.
Kellyanne, you'd mentioned about when you're starting with teams that you do this sort of brainstorming session. So when I talk to faculty and teams, I always tell them, when you start that brainstorming, keep a separate list of what you're going to ask the program officer.
Yeah.
So you're always thinking about that. And so
yeah. And then you have your questions ready. Yeah. The other thing I've done with teams is sometimes there's somebody very senior in the room who isn't necessarily the PI, who has tons of experience in this, and this is kind of old hat to them. I'll just ask them, hey, can you look over their letter for them or something? And then it just takes some of the pressure off. But
yeah, one other option you have specifically with contacting program officers, some calls will have multiple program officers, and even like the Muries, for example, they have a completely different program officer who answers boring administrative questions that I might ask versus somebody who answers topic-specific questions. So when I had to ask things about like, will you care if we include this font and this graphic or something that just seems totally mundane, but you want to ask because you don't want to get disqualified, you can take initiative on those, and I did for the teams I worked with last year because I knew they had more scientific things to worry about, and then wait for the others. The other thing you can do is if you're going to work with a large team, I would say as part of the strategy session, schedule the call with the program officer then, because then everyone's already in the room. And that worked really well because not one person didn't hear the program officer. They were much preferred, I'm sure, a conference call that lasted half an hour than 10 different calls. So.
And we are up on our time, and
Perfect.
I want to thank you guys for coming and presenting. That was a great job. I do want to mention that in November, NIH is hosting their regional conference in Phoenix, and ASU is a host institution. So you should mark that down on your calendars soon. I know that you'll be starting to see some advertisement about that. Yes, ask your program officer if they want to meet you there. Let's give Kellyanne and Tobin a big round of applause. Thanks, everybody.